There's a kind of debt that doesn't show up in any ledger. It's not the money you owe the bank. It's not the note your father signed with shaking hands during the worst drought in 40 years. It's not even the interest that grew like mold in the dark while nobody was looking. No, the worst debt is the one that steals your name. The one that makes people look through you in the street like you're already a ghost. The one that takes a woman who used to stand tall behind her father's counter, who used to laugh loud enough to make the horses twitch, and turns her into something the whole town agrees to forget. I know because I watched it happen. Stood right there on the street in Copper Hill, New Mexico territory, with dust on my boots and nothing useful in my hands, and I watched them take everything she had. Every dish, every chair, her mother's wedding dress held up for auction like a rag. And I did what most men do when they see something that offends their conscience. I looked away. But here's the thing about looking away. Sometimes the thing you're avoiding turns its face toward you anyway. Sometimes a woman's silence is louder than any scream. Sometimes the ledger you've been keeping your whole life, the one where you track every debt given and received, every favor, every wrong, sometimes that ledger opens to a page you didn't write, and the entry there has your name on it. This is the story of how I met Clara Morrow on the worst day of her life, how I tried to help her and failed, how she tried to save herself and nearly didn't, how the desert and the people in it, people most folks wouldn't even call people, taught us both something about what we actually owe each other. And how, in the end, the only debt that mattered was the one neither of us could put into words. I keep a book. Small thing no bigger than my palm, bound in leather so old it's gone the color of tobacco spit. Pages thin as onion skin. I bought it from a peddler in Santa Fe 6 years back, paid 12 cents for it, and I wrote that down on the first page. 12 cents. Leather notebook. Peddler with one eye. Santa Fe. June 1879. Every transaction since then lives in that book. Every dollar earned, every dollar spent, every favor done, and every favor owed. I record them the way some men say prayers, not because I believe it changes anything, but because the ritual keeps me steady. When the world gets loose and sideways, when I can't tell what's right from what's merely convenient, I open the book and look at the columns. Credits on the left, debits on the right, and in the narrow margin between them, the truth of who I am. My name is Silas Kane. I am 34 years old. I run 40 head of cattle on a piece of land north of the Jornada del Muerto that most sensible men wouldn't spit on. I have no wife, no children, no particular ambition beyond keeping the cattle alive and the coyotes confused. I talk too much when I'm nervous and not enough when it matters. And on the morning of September 14th, 1885, I rode into Copper Hill to buy salt and turpentine and rode out carrying something I never asked for and couldn't return. Copper Hill was the kind of town that existed because two roads crossed each other and somebody had built a saloon at the intersection. Beyond that, there wasn't much to recommend it. A general store with a warped porch, a feed lot that smelled like regret, a church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays and a courtroom whenever the circuit judge came through, which wasn't often. I'd been there maybe a dozen times in 6 years. Enough to know faces, not names. Enough to nod at the woman who ran the store and accept the hard candy she always pressed into my palm like I was 9 years old. Her name was, well, I'll get to that. But that morning the town was different. I could feel it before I saw it. The way you feel a storm coming not from the sky but from the ground, from the way the air tightens and the birds go quiet. There were too many people on the street for a Tuesday. Wagons parked at angles. Men standing in clusters with their arms crossed, wearing expressions that were trying very hard to look like disapproval but were really closer to hunger. I tied my horse at the rail outside the feed lot and walked toward the crowd, because that's what you do in a small town when people gather. You join them. Not out of curiosity, exactly, but out of the same instinct that makes cattle drift toward one another when the wind shifts. Safety in numbers. Or at least the illusion of it. The crowd had formed a rough half-circle in front of the general store, and on the porch of that store, arranged like goods at a market, because that is exactly what they were, sat the entire contents of someone's life. Chairs, a table with one short leg shimmed with a folded piece of cardboard. Pots, pans, a cast-iron skillet so well seasoned it gleamed black as a preacher's Bible, stacks of folded cloth, a wooden chest with brass corners, its lid open to show linens yellowed with age, a rocking chair with a shawl draped over its back, a pair of boots women's size, barely worn, a framed photograph. I couldn't see who was in it from where I stood, but the glass caught the light. And standing behind all of it, with a sheaf of papers in one hand and a self-satisfaction on his face that made me want to break something, stood Harlan Briggs. I knew Briggs not well, not warmly. He was the kind of man who owned things, land, buildings, notes of debt, and who derived from that ownership a sense of moral authority that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with arithmetic. He was maybe 50, lean and dry as a strip of jerky. With a thin mustache he groomed the way other men groomed horses. He wore a suit even in summer. He sweated through it constantly, and the damp patches under his arms were the only honest thing about him. "Item number 14, Briggs called out, consulting his papers. His voice carried that particular flatness of a man who has practiced being reasonable until it became a kind of weapon. "One oak rocking chair, handmade. I'm told it was a wedding gift. Starting bid, $1. A murmur went through the crowd. Someone raised a hand. Someone else coughed. I looked around for the person whose wedding gift was being sold on a porch in front of strangers, and I found her. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, apart from everyone, the way a stone sits apart from water even when the river flows around it. She wore a gray dress, not the fashionable kind of gray, but the kind that happens when a blue dress has been washed too many times and has given up trying. Her hair was pulled back tight, and her hands were clasped in front of her, and she was watching the auction with an expression I have thought about every day since. It wasn't anger, it wasn't grief, it was something worse. It was the careful, deliberate blankness of a person who has decided not to feel anything because feeling anything at all would end them. I had seen that look once before, on a man who'd been shot in the gut and was waiting for the doctor, and who had gone so far inside himself that the pain couldn't follow. She was maybe 23, maybe younger. It's hard to tell age on a face that's been stripped of everything but endurance. "Sold," Briggs said. $1.50, item 15. "That's my mother's chair." The voice came from the woman. It was quiet, almost conversational, and it stopped Briggs mid-sentence the way a stone stops a wheel. Every head turned. "I beg your pardon, Miss Morrow." I said, "That's my mother's chair. She died in that chair. My father carved it for her the winter they were married. It's not yours to sell." Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man who has rehearsed patience. "Miss Morrow, we have been through this. Your father's debts." "My father's debts were to you, not to my mother's memory." "Your father's debts are secured against his property, all of his property, as I have explained and as the judge has confirmed. The judge is your cousin." A ripple went through the crowd. Not of surprise, everyone knew Judge Welland was Briggs's cousin, but of the particular discomfort that comes when someone says the thing everyone has agreed not to say. Briggs's jaw tightened. "Miss Morrow, if you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I will have the sheriff escort you from the premises." She looked at him, just looked, and in that look was something I recognized because I've seen it in animals backed into corners, not the wildness of a thing about to fight, but the terrible stillness of a thing that has calculated the odds and found them wanting, and has decided to stand anyway, not because standing will change the outcome, but because sitting down would be worse. "Then have him escort me," she said, "but that is my mother's chair." Nobody moved. The sheriff, a large, uncomfortable man named Dawes who had clearly been hoping to get through this morning without having to make any decisions, shifted his weight and studied the ground. Briggs shuffled his papers. "Item 15, Briggs said, moving on, and that was it. The chair stayed on the porch. The auction continued. And Clara Morrow, I learned her name later, but I'll use it now because she deserves the dignity of a name from the start. Clara Morrow stood in the same spot and watched the rest of her life get sold to strangers. I should have said something, done something, but what? I didn't know her. I didn't know the details. I was a man with 40 cattle and a leather notebook and no particular standing in a town I visited twice a year for salt and turpentine. I watched them sell the table with one short leg. I watched them sell the boots. I watched them sell the photograph. It went to an old woman who held it close and squinted at it, and I saw her lips move as she recognized whoever was in it, and then she tucked it into her coat and walked away. The linens went for $3. The skillet went for 75 cents. A set of hand-painted teacups, 4 of them, chipped but beautiful with blue flowers on the rims, went to the barkeep, who probably intended to use them for whiskey and wouldn't care about the flowers. And through all of it, Clara Morrow stood and watched with that terrible blank face, and her hands stayed clasped in front of her, and her knuckles went white, and nobody, not one person in that crowd of 40, said a word. I wrote in my book that night, September 14, Copper Hill, watched a woman lose everything, did nothing, cost unknown. The auction took 2 hours. When it was done, the porch was empty except for a few items that hadn't attracted bids: a broken lamp, a stack of water-damaged books, a child's toy horse with one ear missing. These Briggs left where they sat with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if even the act of claiming them was beneath him. The crowd dissolved. People drifted away carrying their purchases, avoiding Clara's eyes with the careful choreography of those who know they have participated in something ugly, but have not yet decided to feel bad about it. The September sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened and the dust settled, and Clara was alone on the street. I was loading my horse when I heard the sound. It's hard to describe. It wasn't crying, not exactly. It was more like the sound a person makes when the thing they've been holding in finally cracks the container. A single, sharp intake of breath, followed by a silence so dense it'd weight. I looked over and saw Clara standing beside the porch, her hand on the rocking chair. The one item Briggs had skipped, and her head was bowed, and her shoulders were shaking, but she made no more sound. I have in my life walked past suffering more times than I am proud of. I've told myself the stories we all tell ourselves. It's not my business, there's nothing I can do, someone else will help, getting involved will only make things worse. These are true stories most of the time, and they are also coward stories, and I have told them all. But something about the way she held onto that chair, the way her fingers curled around the arm of it like it was the last solid thing in a world gone liquid. Something about that made me put down the salt and turpentine and walk across the street. "Ma'am." She didn't look up. "Ma'am, I'm not from here, and I don't know your situation, but—" "Then you don't need to be standing here." She still hadn't looked up. Her voice was steady, which was worse than if it had been broken. "No," I agreed. "I don't, but I am." She raised her head then, and her eyes, brown, dark, dry as the desert that surrounded us, met mine with a directness that felt physical. She was sizing me up the way you size up a horse you're considering buying. Not with hope, but with practiced assessment. "I don't need charity," she said. "I wasn't offering any." "Then what are you offering?" That was a fair question, and I didn't have an answer for it. What was I offering? I had 40 head of cattle and a leather notebook and a ranch that was one bad winter away from collapse. I had nothing to give this woman that would undo what had been done to her. "I don't rightly know," I said, and the honesty of that seemed to surprise us both. She almost smiled. Not quite. The ghost of one, maybe, the memory of a time when smiling was something her face did without consulting her first. "At least you're honest," she said. "That's more than I've gotten today." We stood there for a moment in the kind of silence that happens between strangers who have accidentally stumbled onto common ground, and I noticed things about her that the distance had hidden. The way one of her sleeves was mended at the elbow with thread that didn't match. The calluses on her hands, working hands, not ornamental ones. A bruise on her wrist, half hidden by the cuff, that was fading from purple to yellow. "Your father," I said, because I'd gathered that much from the auction. "He passed 3 months ago. He owed Harlan Briggs $1,200. He'd been paying it down $50 a year plus interest. He had 8 years left." She said this with the flatness of someone reciting numbers she'd recited many times before, to lawyers and judges and anyone who would listen and plenty who wouldn't. "When he died, Briggs called the whole note due, said the terms specified repayment in the event of, what did he call it? The debtor's cessation of capacity, meaning death." "That's legal, yes, Judge Wellen confirmed it." Her mouth tightened. "The store was worth maybe $300. The ranch, if you can call 40 acres of dust and brush a ranch, maybe $400. That left $500, which is why," she gestured at the empty porch, "everything else." "And now—" She looked at me, and in her eyes was something that I can only describe as a dare, not the reckless kind. The kind a person issues when they've already lost, and they want to see if you'll flinch. "Now I have a rocking chair," she said, "and the clothes I'm standing in, and whatever Briggs decides to do about the remaining $112 he says I still owe." "You still owe him?" "According to his arithmetic, yes, after everything was sold. $112, he's given me 30 days to produce it, or—" She stopped, swallowed. "Or I work it off." The way she said work it off carried a weight that settled in my stomach like a stone. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. Briggs owned the saloon and the rooms above it, and everyone in Copper Hill knew what those rooms were for. And nobody talked about it because talking about it would mean admitting that the man who sat in the front pew at church every Sunday was also the man who... I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger exactly, something older. Something that lived in the same part of me where the ledger lived, the part that kept accounts, that tracked what was owed and what was fair and what was not. And the entry I was writing in my head said, "This is wrong. This is wrong, and you know it is wrong, and walking away will mean that you know you walked away from something wrong." "Where will you go?" I asked. "I don't know." "Do you have family?" "Somewhere else." "My mother's people were from St. Louis. I wrote to an aunt there. She hasn't replied." Clara's hand tightened on the rocking chair. "She may not have gotten the letter, or she may not want to involve herself. Either way." "Either way," I repeated. The words sat between us, doing nothing useful. I looked at my horse, loaded with salt and turpentine. I looked at the empty porch, the broken lamp, the water-damaged books. I looked at Clara Morrow, standing in the September sun in a faded gray dress, holding onto a rocking chair because it was the last piece of her mother she had, and I did the single stupidest thing I have done in 34 years of doing stupid things. "I have a ranch," I said. "It's not much, it's not anything really. 40 acres, a house that leaks when it rains, which it almost never does, so at least there's that. I need help with the cattle. I can't pay much, but I can pay something, and there's a room. It was supposed to be a storeroom, but it's got a door and a window, and it's dry." She stared at me. I fumbled. "I'm not proposing anything improper. I'm saying I need a hand and you need a place, and those two things might fit together for a while, until your aunt writes back, or until something better comes along, which, given the current situation, shouldn't be hard." For a long time, she didn't answer. She looked at me the way I've seen deer look at things they can't categorize. Not prey, not predator, something in between, something that demands a decision without providing enough information to make one. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Silas Kane." "And you want me to ride to your ranch in the middle of nowhere with a man I've never met, based on what? The goodness of your heart." "Ma'am, I don't think goodness has much to do with it. I think I'm standing here because I watched what happened today, and I don't want to write it down in my book as something I walked away from. That's selfishness, if we're being precise." She blinked. "Your book." I showed her the ledger. She looked at it the way people always look at it, with confusion that slowly becomes something else. She turned a few pages, read a few entries, and then, for the first time since I'd seen her, her face did something that wasn't blank or braced or calculating. She laughed. It was small and surprised, and it died quickly, but it was real, and it changed her whole face, and I remember thinking, there's someone in there. Behind all that armor, there's someone who used to laugh without checking first to see if it was safe. "You wrote down the price of a haircut," she said. 15 cents, barber in Las Cruces, he nicked my ear. "And you wrote that down too. Nicked ear, no discount given, injustice." "It was an injustice." I bled. She closed the book and handed it back to me, and the ghost of the laugh still hung around her mouth. "Mr. Kane, you are either the strangest man I've ever met or the most honest, and I'm not sure those are different things." "I've been told they're not." She looked back at the rocking chair, at the empty porch, at the town that had stood by and watched and done nothing. "Can we take the chair?" she asked. We left Copper Hill at noon. Clara rode my pack horse, a calm, patient animal named Buckwheat who had the good sense not to form opinions about his passengers. And the rocking chair was strapped to the pack frame beside the salt and turpentine, which gave the whole arrangement the appearance of a traveling furniture store run by lunatics. We didn't talk much those first hours. The road north out of Copper Hill cuts through broken mesa country, red rock and juniper, with the Jornada stretching out to the east like a warning. The sun was high and the air was dry, and the only sounds were hooves on hardpack and the occasional creak of the rocking chair as it shifted against its ropes. I've always found that the desert tells you things about the people you're with. Some people fight the silence, fill it with chatter because the emptiness scares them. Some people sink into it like a bath. Clara did neither. She occupied the silence the way she occupied the saddle, carefully, with balance, giving nothing away. It was late afternoon. the shadows starting to reach when she spoke. "How much did they give you?" "For the salt, £3.80. Halloran's store. The one with the warped porch. I didn't catch the—" I stopped, looked at her. "Wait, that was your store." "My father's mine for 3 months, until it wasn't." The weight of that settled over us. She had watched me buy supplies from her own store or what had been her store without either of us knowing. I thought about that for a long time. The strange, small cruelties of circumstance. "The salt was good quality," I offered, because I am at my core an idiot. But she took it the way it was intended, as a clumsy kindness, and nodded. "My father sourced it from a mine near Chilarosa. He was particular about salt, said you could tell a man's character by the salt he kept." She paused. "I'm not sure that's true, but he believed it, and he was a good man, and sometimes a good man's beliefs are worth more than a true man's facts." That was the first thing she told me about Thomas Morrow. Over the days and weeks that followed, I would learn more about his gentleness, his stubbornness, the way he'd extend credit to families who couldn't pay and write off the debt in December as a kind of unofficial Christmas gift that he never acknowledged and nobody thanked him for, because that would have embarrassed everyone involved. About his bad hip and his worse judgment, and the way he'd trusted Harlan Briggs because Briggs wore a suit and spoke in complete sentences. And Thomas Morrow believed that these things were evidence of good character rather than evidence of practice. But that first day, all she told me was about the salt, and I wrote it down that evening by firelight. September 14. Evening camp. Clara Morrow. Her father cared about salt. This seems important, though I cannot say why. We camped that night in a shallow wash where a line of cottonwoods suggested water beneath the sand. The water was there if you dug for it, shallow and warm and tasting of minerals, but drinkable. I made a fire and cooked beans and salt pork, and Clara ate without comment, and afterward she sat in her mother's rocking chair, which we'd set on a flat patch of ground beside the fire, and she rocked slowly, and the creak of it was the only sound besides the wind and the distant yip of coyotes. "You should know something," she said after a long silence. "All right. I'm not a charity case. Whatever arrangement this is, it's work for shelter. I can cook, mend, keep accounts, manage stock. I ran that store for 3 months after my father died, and I ran it well. The books were balanced, the inventory was straight, the customers were served. It wasn't the running of it that failed, it was the debt behind it." "I understand. I want that to be clear. I'm not some wounded bird you've picked up. I'm a person who has been placed in a bad position by a bad man, and I am going to get out of it, with or without your help. Preferably with, because the alternative is less pleasant, but with or without." "Understood." She rocked a moment longer. "You're not going to argue with me. Tell me it's not charity. Would it help if I did?" "No. Then I won't." She looked at me across the fire, and something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, more like a door being unbolted but not yet opened. "You're a strange man, Silas Kane." "So I've been told." That night, after she'd gone to sleep in the small tent I'd pitched for her, I slept outside, under the stars, which I preferred anyway. I lay on my bedroll and looked up at the sky and thought about ledgers. About the columns of credit and debit that I'd kept so carefully for 6 years, as if the act of recording a life could substitute for the act of living one. I thought about Thomas Morrow and his salt and his trust and his bad judgment. About Harlan Briggs and his papers and his patience and his cousin the judge. About Clara, standing on the street in her faded dress, watching the auction with that terrible blankness, and the way she'd finally cracked when she touched the chair, not dramatically, not with sobs or wailing, but with that single sharp breath, that tiny fracture in the wall she'd built, letting through just enough pain to prove the wall was necessary. And I thought about the entry I'd make in the morning, September 15. First day of something, not sure what, not sure it matters what I call it. What matters is the column it goes in. I fell asleep before I decided which column that was. The ride to my ranch took 2 more days. We talked more on the second day, not about anything heavy. She asked about the cattle. I told her about Buckwheat's personality, which was considerable. She laughed twice, both times small and quick, like she was stealing something and needed to be fast about it. On the 3rd day, we crested the ridge above my place, and I saw it through her eyes, and I felt the familiar sting of seeing a thing you've grown accustomed to through the fresh clarity of a stranger's gaze. It was not impressive. A house, one-story, adobe and timber, with a roof that sagged in the middle like a horse with a heavy rider. A corral that needed mending. A barn that was generous to call a barn, more of a large shed with ambitions. Beyond it, 40 acres of scrub and grass and the distant blue line of the mountains, and the cattle scattered across it like afterthoughts. Clara started. "You don't have to say anything kind," I said. "I know what it is." I was going to say it's honest. I looked at her. She was looking at the ranch the way I imagine a castaway looks at a raft, not with admiration, but with the particular gratitude reserved for things that are barely adequate but present. "It's honest," she said again, more quietly, and I understood that she was not talking about the buildings or the land or the state of the roof. She was talking about the absence of pretense, the absence of suits and papers and auctions and cousins who were judges. She was talking about the relief of a place that was exactly what it appeared to be, no more and no less, and how rare that had become in her experience. We rode down the ridge, and the cattle looked up with mild curiosity, and Buckwheat picked his way along the path he knew by heart, and the rocking chair creaked against its ropes, and Clara Morrow entered my life the way water enters cracked earth, slowly, without announcement, filling spaces I hadn't known were empty. I wrote that evening, September 16. "Home, Clara is here. The chair is on the porch. It looks like it belongs," which is more than I can say for either of us, but perhaps belonging is something you grow into like boots. The first week was arithmetic. I don't mean that metaphorically, though I suppose I could. I mean that Clara Morrow spent the first 7 days on my ranch doing actual arithmetic, counting cattle, measuring feed, calculating water consumption, estimating the cost of repairs to the corral fence versus the cost of losing calves through the gaps. She found my ledger of ranch accounts, which I kept separately from the personal book and with considerably less devotion, and she looked at it the way a doctor looks at a patient who has been treating a broken leg, with whiskey and optimism. "You've been spending 40 cents a month on wire you're not using," she said on the fourth morning, standing in the kitchen with my accounts spread across the table like a patient etherized. "You've got coils of it in the barn, 6 months' worth. Meanwhile, you're not tracking water loss from the North Trough, which has a crack in the basin that's costing you, conservatively, 2 gallons a day. In a desert, 2 gallons. I was meaning to fix that. Meaning to isn't fixing." She was right. She was right about most things, it turned out, at least where the ranch was concerned. Within 10 days, she'd reorganized the storeroom, patched the trough with a compound of clay and pine pitch that she mixed herself, and established a feeding schedule for the cattle that was more efficient than anything I'd managed in 6 years of trial and error. She did all of this without asking permission, which should have bothered me but didn't, because the results were immediate and undeniable, and because I am not so proud that I can't recognize competence when it shows up uninvited. What bothered me, though bothered isn't quite the right word, was the way she did it, without pause, without rest. From the moment the sun touched the horizon until it dropped below it again, Clara worked. She cooked breakfast before I was awake. She mended fences while I rode the pasture. She cleaned and organized and repaired and improved with a relentlessness that wasn't dedication exactly, but something closer to desperation. It took me 2 weeks to understand. She wasn't working to earn her keep. She was working to avoid being still. Because stillness meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant confronting the things she'd walled off behind that careful blankness, and she was not ready for that confrontation. I recognized it because I've done it myself. After my mother died, I spent 3 months building a stone wall on my property that served no purpose whatsoever. 20 yards long, 4 feet high, running between nothing and nowhere. I built it with my hands, stone by stone, and the physical labor kept the grief at arm's length, and by the time the wall was done, the grief had softened enough to be carried. The wall still stands. I walk past it sometimes and run my hand along the top and remember the weight of each stone and the specific ache it replaced. Clara's wall was the ranch, and I let her build it because interfering with another person's grief is a cruelty dressed up as concern, and I had no right. It was the 3rd week, October now, the cottonwoods along the wash beginning to turn, the air carrying that particular sharpness that means the desert is remembering it can be cold, when the stillness she'd been avoiding caught up with her. I came back from the south pasture at dusk and found her on the porch in the rocking chair, not rocking, just sitting, staring at the mountains in the fading light. Her hands were in her lap and they were still, which was the first time I'd seen them still since she'd arrived. I sat down on the porch step, which was my usual spot, and I didn't say anything, because sometimes the best thing you can do for another person is occupy the same silence without demanding that it be filled. After a while, minutes, maybe longer, she spoke. He was afraid of Briggs. I waited. My father, he never said it, but I could see it. When Briggs came to the store to collect the monthly payment, my father would, his hands would shake. Not a lot, just a tremor. And he'd count the money out slowly, like if he counted slow enough, the interaction would last long enough to be normal, like it was just a business transaction and not what it was. What was it? Ownership, the word came out flat. Briggs didn't just want the money. He wanted my father to feel the weight of owing it. He'd stand in the store and look around at the shelves, the counter, the walls, and you could see him calculating. Not the value, the power. The knowledge that all of it, everything my father had built, existed at his discretion. She paused, the rocking chair creaked once as if agreeing. And my father would stand behind the counter and hand over the $50 and say, "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," and Briggs would say, "Of course, Thomas," like he was granting a favor, and then he'd leave, and my father would go into the back room and sit down and his hands would stop shaking and he'd say, "8 more years, Clara, 8 more years and we're free." Her voice cracked on the word free, not dramatically. A hairline fracture, almost invisible, but I heard it. He died owing 8 years of payments to a man who called him by his first name and never once invited him to do the same. I sat with that for a long time. The last light was going, the mountains turning from blue to black, and a single star appeared above the ridge, bright and absolute. "I'm sorry," I said, because there was nothing else to say, and because sometimes the truest words are the most useless ones. "Don't be sorry, be angry." I looked at her. That's what I can't get to angry. I want to be angry. I should be angry. But when I try to find it, all I find is this heaviness. Like the anger is there underneath, but it's buried under so much else that I can't dig down to it. And I need it, Silas. I need the anger because the anger is the thing that will get me out of this. The sadness doesn't help. The grief doesn't help. The anger is what I need, and I can't find it. She looked at me, and her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the effort of not crying, which is a different kind of brightness entirely. "How do you find it?" she asked. "When it's buried, how do you dig it out?" I thought about that. I thought about the stone wall and the months of lifting and placing, and the way grief and anger are braided together like rope, and how you can't pull one strand without disturbing the other. "I don't think you dig it out," I said. "I think you let it come up on its own, like water in this desert. You can't force it to the surface. But if you stop packing the ground so hard, if you let the soil loosen, it rises." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded once and went inside, and I heard the door close, and I sat on the porch step in the dark and wrote by the light of the kitchen window, October 5. "Clara is grieving. I told her to let it rise, not sure if that's wisdom or cowardice. Both, maybe." The men came on a Thursday. 3 of them riding up from the South Road, which was the direction of Copper Hill. I saw them from the pasture, 3 dark shapes against the dust-white road, moving with the purposeful pace of men on an errand they didn't choose but intended to complete. By the time I rode back to the house, Clara was already on the porch. She'd seen them too. She stood with her arms at her sides, and the blankness was back, the wall rebuilt in the time it took to spot riders on a road. And I felt a sudden, sharp grief for the softening I'd seen the night before, how quickly it could be undone by the appearance of men on horses. They pulled up at the edge of the property. The lead rider was a man I recognized, Jennings, one of Briggs's employees. He managed the saloon and did other work that didn't get talked about in daylight. He was thick-necked and bland-faced, the kind of man who is dangerous not because he's cruel, but because he's indifferent, and indifference with authority is worse than malice. "Miss Morrow," Jennings said, touching his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and threatening. "Mr. Kane." "Jennings, I'm here on Mr. Briggs's behalf, regarding the outstanding balance." Clara's jaw tightened. "I'm aware of the balance. Mr. Briggs wants me to remind you that you have 12 days remaining on your 30-day grace period. $112. He's prepared to be, his word, flexible regarding the means of repayment." The word flexible hung in the air like smoke. "You can tell Mr. Briggs," Clara said, and her voice was steady, and I admired her for that steadiness even as I feared what it was costing her. That I am aware of his terms and his flexibility, and that I will have his money in 12 days. And if you don't, then he can come and collect it himself, instead of sending errand boys. Jennings looked at her, then at me, then back at her. He was calculating in his slow, indifferent way whether this response constituted defiance worth reporting or merely the bluster of a woman with no options. "I'll pass that along," he said. He touched his hat again, turned his horse, and the three of them rode back the way they'd come, and the dust they raised settled slowly, like the after-image of a bad dream. Clara went inside without a word. I stood in the yard and did the arithmetic she couldn't bring herself to do. $112 in 12 days. I had $37 in savings, which represented 2 years of careful accumulation. The cattle were worth roughly $6 a head, but selling cattle in October meant selling at the year's lowest price, and selling enough to raise $75 meant selling half my herd, which meant the ranch wouldn't survive the winter. There was no good math. Every equation ended in subtraction. I went inside. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands flat on the surface, staring at them as if they held answers. "How much do you have?" she asked without looking up. $37. "I can't take that. I'm not offering it as a gift. I'm offering it as an investment, in a hand that's made this ranch run better in 3 weeks than I managed in 6 years. She shook her head. Even with 37, that's still 75 short. Where does 75 come from in 12 days? I didn't have an answer. She didn't expect one. We sat at the table and listened to the wind against the walls, and neither of us said the thing we were both thinking. That Briggs's flexibility meant one thing, and both of us knew what it was, and both of us knew that 12 days would come and go, and the math would not have changed. The Apache came 2 days later, though came is the wrong word. They were already there. I was riding the north pasture, checking the fence line where a section of wire had sagged when I saw them. An old woman sitting in the shade of a juniper with 2 children beside her. The children were young, a girl maybe 7, a boy maybe 5, and they were sitting very still, the way children sit when they've been told that stillness is survival. The old woman looked up at me as I approached, and her eyes held no fear, which told me everything I needed to know about what she'd already survived. Fear is a luxury of those who still have things to lose. She was Apache. Her dress was worn but clean, and her hair was white and pulled back in a way that suggested formality even in exhaustion. The children were thin, not starving, but lean in the way that speaks of months of not quite enough rather than days of nothing. I dismounted and stood at a distance, close enough to be heard, far enough not to threaten. I've lived in this territory long enough to know that the space between people matters more than the words that cross it. "Ma'am," I said. She studied me. Her face was a landscape, creased and weathered and expressive in the way that very old faces can be, where every line is a sentence in a story you haven't been told. "Your fence is broken," she said, in English that was careful and accented and precise. She pointed to the section of sagging wire behind me. "Yes, ma'am, I know. We came through it 2 days ago. The children were tired." "Are you, is someone with you? A band or—" "We are alone." She said this without self-pity, a statement of geography. "We were walking to the Mescalero Reservation. My daughter's people are there." "But the children—" She looked at the boy, who was asleep now, his head in the girl's lap. "The boy is sick, a fever. He needs rest before we walk again." I looked at the children. The girl met my eyes with an expression that was far too old for 7, an expression that said she understood more than she should have to, and that she was doing the work of being brave for both herself and her brother, and that the weight of it was considerable. "You're welcome to stay," I said. "I have water and food." The old woman studied me again, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who has learned that kindness from strangers often has a price, and who needs to know the price before accepting. "Why?" she asked. It was the same question Clara had asked me, and I gave the same answer because it was still true. "I don't rightly know." She considered this, and something in her expression shifted, a loosening, almost imperceptible, like the first crack in a dam. "My name is Dahana," she said. "These are my daughter's children. Naylan is the girl, the boy is Goyathle." Sela's cane. Sela's, she tasted the name. You keep cattle. 40 head, minus whatever your grandchildren have frightened off. She almost smiled, almost. I brought them to the house. Clara was in the kitchen, and when she saw the old woman and the 2 children, she did something I hadn't expected. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She filled a basin with water, found clean cloth for the boy's fever, heated broth from the pot that was always on the stove, and moved with a quiet efficiency that told me she'd done this before, cared for sick children, tended to people who arrived at a door in need. The store, I realized. The store in Copper Hill. How many travelers had come through, needing something they couldn't pay for, and Thomas Morrow had given it, and Clara had helped, and neither of them had written it in any ledger. Dahana watched Clara with the same careful attention she'd given me, and I saw the moment her assessment shifted from wariness to recognition. One woman seeing another, both stripped of the usual markers of status and safety. Both operating on the raw, essential competence that remains when everything else has been taken away. The boy's fever was not dangerous, but it was real. Clara stayed with him that night, cooling his forehead with damp cloth, and I heard her singing, softly, almost inaudibly, a tune I didn't recognize. When I looked in, the boy was asleep and Clara was sitting beside him, and the girl, Naylin, was asleep too, curled against Clara's side like a cat, and Clara's hand was on the girl's hair, and her face was, I don't know how to describe it, open, unguarded. The wall was down, not because she'd decided to lower it, but because her hands were too full of other people's needs to hold it up. Dahana sat on the porch with me. The rocking chair creaked beneath her, and she rocked with the practiced rhythm of someone who has spent a lifetime finding comfort in small, repetitive motions. The woman, Dahana said, she carries a heavy thing. Yes. Not grief. Grief is heavy, but it moves. This is different. This sits in one place and does not move, like a stone in water. I looked at her. What is it then? Dahana rocked. The stars were thick above us, the Milky Way a bright smear across the black. Shame, she said. Not her shame, someone else's, but she carries it because no one else will. I thought about that. About Thomas Morrow's shaking hands and Harlan Briggs's first-name familiarity, and the auction on the porch, and the crowd that watched and did nothing. About the debt that wasn't really about money, that was about power and submission, and a man's need to see another man diminished. And about Clara inheriting not just the debt but the shame of it, the shame of having been owned, of having been reduced, of having stood in a street while strangers bought her mother's teacups. How does she put it down? I asked. Dahana looked at me with something close to amusement. You cannot put down a stone that is not yours. You can only give it back to the person it belongs to. And if that person won't take it, then you set it at their feet and walk away. And if they follow you with it, you walk faster. I wrote that night, October 8. Dahana says Clara carries someone else's shame. Dahana says to set the stone at Briggs's feet and walk away. I think she may be the wisest person I have ever met. I also think she may be wrong, because walking away requires somewhere to walk to, and Clara doesn't have that yet. The days that followed were strange. The ranch, which had been a place of 2 people and 40 cattle, became a place of 5 people and 40 cattle, and the difference was not arithmetic but atmospheric. The children changed things. Naylin, once the boy's fever broke, revealed herself to be a person of considerable energy and fearsome curiosity. She followed Clara everywhere, asking questions in a mix of Apache and English that Clara navigated with surprising ease. The boy, Goyathle, was quieter, watchful, careful, moving through the world with a gentleness that seemed innate rather than learned. They fed the chickens. They helped patch the fence. Naylin named 3 of the cattle, decisions I was not consulted on and which I now had to live with, because once a 7-year-old names a cow, Thunder. That cow is Thunder forever, and no amount of rancher dignity can undo it. Dana helped Clara in the kitchen, and their collaboration was a thing to observe, 2 women who did not share a language in any complete sense, communicating through gesture and repetition, and the universal grammar of peeling vegetables and kneading dough. Dana taught Clara to make a bread from acorn flour that was dense and slightly sweet, and Clara taught Dahana a biscuit recipe that had been her mother's, and the exchange was conducted with the solemnity of ambassadors exchanging treaties. And in the evenings on the porch, Dana told stories. She told them in Apache, and Naylin translated, imperfectly, selectively, with a child's editorial instinct for what mattered and what didn't. The stories were about people and animals and the spaces between them, about debts owed to the land and debts owed to the dead and debts that could never be repaid but must be honored anyway. Clara listened. She listened the way I'd seen her listen to nothing else, with her whole body, leaning forward, her hands still in her lap. The rocking of the chair stopped. And after the stories, she'd sit in the dark long after Dahina and the children had gone inside, and I could feel her thinking, the way you can feel heat radiating from a stone that's absorbed a full day's sun. On the 8th day, 4 days before Briggs's deadline, Clara came to me in the barn where I was mending tack. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I know how to get the money." I put down the bridle. "How?" "My father had a policy, life insurance, taken out through a company in Albuquerque, $200 payable to his estate upon death. I forgot about it, or I didn't forget exactly, but in the chaos of everything, I filed the claim before the auction. 3 months ago, I wrote to the company. I never heard back, and I assumed." "You assumed Briggs had gotten to them." "I assumed something, but yesterday, while sorting through the books you keep, or don't keep more accurately, I found a letter. It was in with your mail, on the table, where it's been sitting under a seed catalog for apparently 2 weeks. She held up an envelope. It was addressed to Clara Morrow, care of Sila's Cane, at my ranch address. The return address was a life insurance company in Albuquerque. "I gave this address in my follow-up letter," she said. 2 weeks ago, they wrote back." She opened the envelope. Inside was a bank draft for $200. I stared at it. $200, more than the debt, more than enough. "Clara, I can pay Briggs the full 112 and have 88 left over. Enough to, I don't know, start something. Not enough to get the store back, but enough to—" She stopped because she was crying. Not the way she'd cried at the auction, that silent, controlled fracture. This was different. This was open and messy and real, the kind of crying that comes when the weight you've been carrying shifts just enough for you to feel how heavy it actually was. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes and her shoulders shook, and she made sounds that were not words, and I stood there in the barn with a bridle in one hand and no useful skills whatsoever. "I'm sorry," she said, gasping. "I'm sorry I don't apologize for this. It's just I didn't think. I thought there was no way out. I thought the only options were his options. And the whole time, the answer was sitting under a seed catalog on your kitchen table." She laughed through the tears, and the sound was so unexpected and so human that I felt something break loose in my own chest. Something I hadn't known was stuck. "Under a seed catalog," she repeated, and laughed again and cried again. And I handed her a rag that was probably not clean enough for the purpose but was the closest thing available. And she took it and wiped her face and looked at me with eyes that were red and swollen and brighter than I had ever seen them. "I'm going to Copper Hill," she said. "Tomorrow, I'm going to walk into Briggs's office and put $112 on his desk and tell him we're done. Do you want company?" She considered this. And then she said something that I think about still, years later, at odd moments. Saddling a horse, watching a sunset, lying awake at 3 in the morning when the coyotes are singing and the dark is very large. "I want company on the ride," she said, "but when I walk into his office, I walk in alone." I nodded, because I understood, because there are debts that can only be settled by the person who carries them, and the settling requires witnesses but not participants. Because what Briggs had taken from Clara was not just money or property or a rocking chair. He had taken her ability to stand in a room with a man who had power over her and say, "I owe you nothing." And the reclaiming of that, the simple, enormous act of standing before the person who diminished you and declaring yourself free, that was hers to do. No one else's. "Alone," I agreed. And she nodded and folded the bank draft carefully and put it in her dress pocket and pressed her hand flat against it, as if to reassure herself it was real, and walked out of the barn into the October sunlight. And I watched her cross the yard, and for the first time since I'd known her, she was walking fast. I picked up the bridle and tried to go back to mending it, but my hands weren't steady, and after a while I put it down and opened my book and wrote, October 10. Clara is walking fast. I think that's what hope looks like when it catches you off guard. $200 under a seed catalog. Thomas Morrow, wherever you are, well done. We left for Copper Hill before dawn. The October air had teeth to it, not the killing cold that would come in December, but a sharpness that announced intentions. The kind of morning where your breath hangs in front of you for a moment, ghostly and brief, before the desert air swallows it. Clara rode Buckwheat, and I rode my horse, a leggy sorrel named Dust who had earned his name through a complete lack of imagination. And behind us the ranch grew small against the ridge, and Dahanna stood on the porch in the rocking chair's glow with the children at her feet, and she raised one hand and we rode. Clara hadn't slept. I knew this because I hadn't slept either, and at 2 in the morning when I'd gone to the kitchen for water, I'd seen the light under her door and heard the creak of the floorboards as she paced. Pacing is something Clara did when she was building herself for something. Assembling the architecture of courage, brick by brick, the way her father had assembled shelves, the way I assembled entries in my ledger. Everyone has their method. Hers was motion. She carried the bank draft in a leather wallet that had been her father's. I'd seen her put it there the night before, checking it twice. Then a third time, the way people check locks before leaving a house, not because they doubt the mechanism, but because the act of checking is itself a kind of prayer. Please be real. Please still be there. Please don't dissolve between now and morning like every other good thing. We rode south through the broken country, the mesas rising around us like the walls of a church built by something older and less interested in worship. The junipers were dark against the red rock, and the cottonwoods along the washes were turning gold, and a hawk circled above us in the warming air, patient and precise. And I thought about how the world goes on being beautiful even when the people in it are not, and how that's either a comfort or an insult depending on which direction you're riding. "Tell me something," Clara said, an hour into the ride. Her voice cut the silence cleanly without warning the way she did most things. "What would you like to know? Why do you keep the book?" I adjusted my hat. Dust snorted. The question was not casual, I could tell by the way she asked it, with her eyes forward, giving me the privacy to decide how honest to be. "My father was a drunk," I said. It came out easily, which surprised me. I'd said it before, but not often, and usually to myself, and usually in the dark. Not the violent kind, the disappearing kind, the kind who promises things to come to dinner to fix the gate, to be there when the mare foals and then isn't there. And when you asked where he'd been, he'd say, "I must have lost track," and look at you with this genuine confusion, like the hours had simply slipped out of his hands without his noticing. Buckwheat's hooves clicked on the hardpack. Clara waited. He lost track of everything. Money, time, promises. Nothing was solid with him. Nothing stayed where he put it. And when he died, I was 20. I went through his things and found nothing. No records, no accounts, no evidence that he'd lived in the world in any organized way. Just a pile of receipts and a lot of empty bottles and the vague impression of a man who'd been present in the room but not in his own life. I touched the book in my coat pocket, feeling its weight. So I started keeping track of everything. Every cent, every exchange, every favor. Because I was afraid, I am afraid, that if I don't write it down, it'll slip away from me the way it slipped away from him. That I'll become a man who loses track. Clara looked at me then. Not with pity, she was not a woman who trafficked in pity, but with understanding, which is different and harder and more useful. "Your father and mine," she said. "Different problems, same result. They trusted the wrong things to hold them up." "What did your father trust?" "People, he trusted people." She said it simply, without bitterness, which was more damning than bitterness would have been. "He believed that if you were fair with people, they would be fair with you. That honesty was its own protection. He was wrong, of course. But he was wrong in a way I can respect, which is more than I can say for most people who are right." We rode in silence for a while after that, and the silence was companionable, the kind that happens when two people have shown each other something true and are waiting for the shape of it to settle. Copper Hill appeared around midday, the same collection of weathered buildings, the same dusty intersection, the same warped porch where Clara's life had been auctioned 3 weeks before. But the town looked different to me now, the way a place looks different when you're arriving with purpose instead of accident. Smaller somehow, less permanent. A handful of buildings clinging to the desert like barnacles on a rock that the tide would eventually take. We tied the horses at the rail outside the feed lot. Clara dismounted and stood for a moment, looking at the town, and I could see her assembling the last pieces of whatever she'd been building during the night of pacing and the morning of writing. The architecture was nearly complete. One more brick. "I'll be in the saloon," I said. "Not drinking, just nearby." She nodded. She didn't thank me. Thanking would have weakened the structure she'd built, introduced an element of dependence she couldn't afford right now. She needed to walk into Briggs's office as someone who owed nothing, not money, not gratitude, not explanation. And I understood that, and I let her go. She walked across the street toward the building that served as Briggs's office, a two-story structure next to the saloon, painted white in a town where nothing else was, because Briggs understood that the appearance of cleanliness is a form of authority. She opened the door and went inside, and the door closed behind her, and I was left standing in the street with two horses and a feeling in my chest like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air is thick with what's about to happen. I went into the saloon. It was nearly empty, one old man nursing a beer, a bartender wiping glasses with performative diligence. I ordered water, which earned me a look of mild contempt, and I sat at a table near the window where I could see the door to Briggs's office, and I waited. She was inside for 40 minutes. 40 minutes. I know because I counted them, the way I count everything, each minute marked by the tick of the clock above the bar and the slow rotation of dust motes in the shaft of light from the window. 40 minutes of not knowing what was happening behind that white door, whether Clara was standing or sitting, whether Briggs was being reasonable or whether reasonableness had never been part of his plan, whether the bank draft was on his desk or still in her father's wallet, whether the words she'd prepared were coming out the way she'd rehearsed them or whether they'd scattered the moment she saw his face. I thought about going in. 4 separate times I put my hands on the table to push myself up, and 4 separate times I didn't. Because she'd said alone, and alone meant alone, and the hardest form of respect is the kind that requires you to do nothing when every instinct says to do something. At the 41-minute mark, the door opened. Clara came out. She stood on the boardwalk in front of Briggs's office, and the sun was directly overhead, and she cast almost no shadow, and she stood very straight, and she was not crying, and she was not smiling, and her face held an expression I had never seen on her or anyone. An expression that I can only describe as the face a person makes when a chain they've worn so long they'd forgotten it was there finally falls away, and they feel the first raw second of its absence. And they don't know yet whether the feeling is relief or vertigo or both. She stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she walked across the street to where I was sitting in the saloon window, and she came inside, and she sat down across from me, and she put her hands flat on the table, the same gesture she'd made in my kitchen, hands flat, as if steadying the world through her palms, and she said, "It's done. He took the money. He took the money, he wrote a receipt. He signed it, I signed it, the clerk witnessed it. $112, paid in full, account closed." And she looked at me with those dark eyes, and something was different in them. Something had shifted. Not the warmth had been growing for days, slowly, like the cottonwoods turning. It was the clarity. The eyes of a person who has been looking at the world through smudged glass and has finally wiped it clean. And he said, "I hope you understand this was never personal, Miss Morrow." And I said, "Mr. Briggs, I hope you understand that it was." She paused, and then I left. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. And then, because I am who I am, I took out my book and wrote, October 12, Copper Hill. Clara Morrow settled her father's debts, $112, paid in full. Cost, 3 weeks, 1 porch auction, 1 rocking chair, 1 bank draft under a seed catalog, and a lifetime of shame returned to its rightful owner. Clara watched me write, and when I looked up, she was smiling, not the ghost of a smile, not the memory of one. A real, full, present-tense smile that changed the geography of her face, and made the saloon brighter, and made the old man with his beer look up and blink. "You and that book," she said. "Me and this book. You know, there are things that don't fit in columns. I'm learning that." We stayed in Copper Hill for 3 hours. Clara had errands, practical things, the kind of business that is only possible when you are no longer drowning. She visited the post office to check for a letter from her aunt. There was one. The aunt in St. Louis had written back, apologizing for the delay. She'd been ill. The letter had been forwarded twice, the usual chain of small failures that separates intention from action. She invited Clara to come stay with her. There was work in St. Louis, the aunt wrote. Opportunities, a fresh start. Clara read the letter standing in the post office, and I watched the emotions cross her face the way weather crosses a landscape, quickly in layers, each one changing the light. Relief, gratitude, and underneath both, something quieter and harder to name. The particular sadness of having a door open when you've already started building a room. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and didn't say anything about it. Not then. We also visited the general store, the one that had been hers. It was being run now by a man named Stokes, who Briggs had installed as manager. The shelves were the same. The counter was the same. The bell above the door still rang with the same tone, that thin metallic note that Clara must have heard 10,000 times. But the candy jar was gone, the one the woman behind the counter had always pressed into my palm. Clara noticed its absence and said nothing, but I saw her eyes find the empty spot on the counter where it used to sit, and I saw her hand move to touch the space, and I saw her pull it back. Some things, once taken, leave a shape behind. And the shape is sometimes worse than the loss, because the shape is the proof that the thing was real, that it was there, that its absence is not your imagination but the world's cruelty. We left Copper Hill at 3 in the afternoon. The sun was sliding west, and the light was gold, and the road stretched north into the Mesa country, and Clara rode buckwheat with her shoulders straight and the letter from St. Louis in one pocket and the receipt from Briggs in the other. And I rode beside her and said nothing, because some silences are holy, and this was one of them. The ride back was different from the ride out. The air between us had changed, not charged exactly, but altered, the way air alters after a storm, when everything smells like wet earth and possibility. Clara talked more than she had in 3 weeks. She talked about the store, about the regulars, about the man who came in every Saturday for tobacco and always left his change on the counter as a tip, and about the woman who bought flour in bulk because she ran a bakery out of her kitchen and wouldn't admit it because she thought her husband would disapprove, even though everyone in town bought her bread and her husband ate it every morning. She talked about her father's stories, which were mostly about salt and the people who valued it, and about her mother's laugh, which was loud and sudden and often inappropriate, and about the way the two of them had been together, not romantic in the storybook sense, but matched, the way a mortise and tenon are matched, each one incomplete without the other but functional, solid, load-bearing. And she talked about what she wanted, not in grand terms, not a new store, not a fortune, not revenge against Briggs, in small terms. She wanted a place where the books balanced. She wanted to sell salt to people who cared about salt. She wanted to sit on a porch in a rocking chair and listen to the evening come in, and she wanted the evening to come in without carrying threats. "That's not a lot to want," I said. "It's everything to want," she said. "The people who think it's not a lot are the people who have always had it." We arrived home after dark. The ranch was lit by a single lamp in the kitchen, and through the window I could see Dahana and the children at the table, eating, and the scene had the quality of a painting, warm light, still figures, the suggestion of safety in a frame of darkness. Clara went inside, and I heard the reunion, Nalen's voice high and delighted, the boys' quieter greeting, Dahana's low words in Apache that I couldn't translate but could understand, because some sounds carry meaning independent of language. Welcome, gladness, the particular warmth of a household reassembling after an absence. I stayed outside for a while, fed the horses, checked the cattle, stood in the corral and looked at the stars, which were the same stars I'd looked at for 6 years but which seemed, somehow, rearranged. As if the constellations had shifted slightly to accommodate a new configuration of things below them. When I went inside, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with Dahana. The children were asleep. The two women were talking, Clara in English, Dahana in her careful, accented English, with long pauses between sentences that were not awkward but deliberate, the pauses of people who are saying important things and want to make sure each one lands. "She's leaving," Clara said when I sat down. I looked at Dahana. "The boy is well now," Dahana said. "We have rested, we will walk to the reservation. My daughter's people are there." "How far?" I asked. 4 days walking. Maybe 5 with the children. I opened my mouth to offer something, a horse, food, company for the road, but Clara spoke first. "I'll ride with you," she said. Dahana looked at her. "I have a horse, buckwheat, I mean, if Silas will lend him. The children can ride. It'll cut the trip in half," and she stopped, started again. "And I want to see you arrive. I want to know you got there." Dahana studied Clara the way she studied everything, with that deep, unhurried attention that seemed to take in not just the surface of a thing but its roots. And then she reached across the table and took Clara's hand and held it, and said something in Apache that made Clara's eyes fill. "What did she say?" I asked Nayland later, when the girl was sleepy enough to answer questions without challenging them. Nayland yawned. She said the stone is lighter now. They left the next morning, Clara, Dahana, the children, buckwheat loaded with food and water and blankets. The rocking chair stayed on the porch. I watched them go from the ridge above the ranch. Clara turned once and raised her hand, the same gesture Dahana had made when we left 2 days before, that simple, upward motion that is neither a wave nor a salute but something older than both. A marker, an acknowledgement of the space that was about to open between two people, and a promise that the space would not become a severance. I raised my hand in return, and they rode down the far side of the ridge, and the dust rose behind them, and then they were gone. The ranch was very quiet. I've lived alone for 6 years. I know quiet. I know the sounds a house makes when it's the only thing breathing, the settling of timbers, the tick of cooling metal, the particular silence that fills a room when no one else is in it. I know these sounds, and they've been my companions, and I've made peace with them the way you make peace with weather. But this quiet was different. This was the quiet of absence, which is not the same as the quiet of solitude. Solitude is a country you choose. Absence is a country that chooses you. And the difference is everything, because in solitude the silence is yours, and in absence the silence belongs to the person who left. I spent the day working, fixed the fence section where Dahana had come through, checked the cattle. Thunder and her companions were fine, indifferent to the emotional upheavals of the humans who claimed to own them. Cleaned the kitchen, which Clara had left spotless because of course she had. Found a jar of Dahana's acorn bread on the counter, wrapped in cloth with no note because notes were not part of Dahana's communication style. The bread was there. The meaning was in the bread. That evening I sat on the porch in the rocking chair, Clara's rocking chair, her mother's rocking chair. Thomas Morrow's wedding gift, carved the winter he was married, sat in by a woman who died in it, auctioned on a porch in Copper Hill, carried by packhorse across the desert, and now sitting on my porch, empty, creaking in the wind. I opened my book and looked at the last few weeks of entries. The arrival, the auction, the ride north, Clara's work, Dahana and the children, the bank draft, the settlement, the departure. Each entry careful, precise, logged in my small, even handwriting, the columns balanced, credits and debits accounted for. And I realized, sitting there in the fading light, that the book was wrong. Not in its facts, the facts were accurate, but in its premise. The premise of the book, my 6-year project of recording every transaction, every exchange, every favor given and received, was that life could be accounted for. That if you tracked the inputs and outputs carefully enough, honestly enough, you could arrive at a sum that told you who you were. But some things don't sum. Some things don't balance. The 3 weeks Clara Morrow spent on my ranch, what column do I put that in? The sound of Nayland naming a cow thunder, the weight of Dahana's hand on Clara's, the expression on Clara's face when she walked out of Briggs's office, that expression that was relief and vertigo and the first breath of a life she'd thought was over. What's the entry? What's the amount? Where's the column? I sat with the book open on my knee, the pen in my hand, and I couldn't write. For the first time in 6 years, I had no entry to make, because the thing I'd experienced was larger than the ledger, and the ledger, for all its precision, was a small thing trying to contain a large truth, and it couldn't. And the realization of that, the understanding that my careful, meticulous record of life was not life itself, but a shadow of it, flat and partial and missing all the dimensions that mattered, sat in my chest like a stone. Dahana's stone, the one you can't put down because it isn't yours, except this one was mine. It had always been mine. The stone of believing that if I kept track, nothing could slip away, that if I wrote it down, it was real. That the book was protection against becoming my father, the man who lost track, who let things slide, who disappeared into his own blur. But my father hadn't disappeared because he didn't keep records. He disappeared because he didn't show up. And I had been showing up. For 6 years, I'd been showing up. For the cattle, for the land, for the work. And for 3 weeks, I'd shown up for Clara Morrow and Dahana and 2 children who needed a roof and food and the steady, unspectacular kindness of a man who was present. The book hadn't done that. I had. I closed the book. I didn't throw it away. I'm not a dramatic man, and waste is waste. But I closed it, and I put it in my pocket, and I let the evening come in without writing it down. And the evening came in anyway, just as real, just as present, just as full of stars and coyote song and the creak of a rocking chair that belonged to a woman who wasn't here but who had, in some way I couldn't account for, changed the shape of every room she'd occupied. Clara came back on the 7th day. I didn't expect her. I'd prepared myself for the possibility that she wouldn't, that the road to the reservation would become the road to St. Louis, that the aunt's letter would pull her east, that the $88 in her pocket and the freedom in her spine would carry her to a life that made more sense than a leaky ranch in the middle of nowhere with a man who talked to cattle and kept obsessive records of his haircuts. But on the 7th day, late afternoon, I was in the south pasture, and I saw a rider on the north road, and the rider was on buckwheat, and the rider was Clara. She rode into the yard and dismounted and stood for a moment, looking at the ranch, the house, the barn, the corral, the sagging roof, the stone wall I'd built for no reason, with an expression that I recognized from the first day when she'd called it honest. But this time there was more in it. This time there was the look of a person who has been somewhere else and has come back, and who is seeing a place for the second time, which is the first time you see it truly, because the first time you are only seeing it against what you've lost, and the second time you are seeing it against what you might choose. She walked onto the porch. The rocking chair was there. She put her hand on it, the same gesture from Copper Hill, fingers curling around the arm, but this time her hand was steady. Dana arrived safely, she said. Her daughter was waiting, the children. She paused, smiled. Nayland didn't want me to leave. She asked if I was coming back. I said I didn't know. And now? She looked at me. I got a letter from my aunt. She's holding a position for me at a millinery shop in St. Louis, room and board included. It's a good offer. It sounds like a good offer. It is. She sat down in the rocking chair. It creaked. And I'm not taking it. I stood very still. I wrote to her this morning, thanked her, told her I found work, that I'm where I need to be. Clara, don't say anything noble. Don't say I should go, that St. Louis is safer, that this ranch is one bad winter from collapse. I know all of that. I've done the arithmetic. I was going to say that the trough is leaking again. She stared at me, and then she laughed, that real, full, present-tense laugh that I'd heard once before in a saloon in Copper Hill, and that I'd thought about every day since. The trough, she said. The north one, the patch didn't hold. I told you to use more pine pitch. You told me a lot of things, and you wrote them all down in that book. Not all of them. She rocked, the chair creaked. The sun was dropping toward the mountains, and the light was doing the thing it does in October in the desert, turning everything gold and violet and making every surface into something worthy of attention. The barn, the corral fence, the stupid stone wall, Clara's face. There's something I want to say, she said, and I need to say it plainly because I've spent 3 weeks learning how to say things plainly, and I don't want to go back to the other way. All right. You didn't save me, I need you to know that. I saved myself. The insurance money was my father's provision. The courage to walk into Briggs's office was mine. The decision to come back was mine. You didn't save me. I know. What you did was, you stood nearby. You stood nearby and you were honest about your reasons and you didn't ask for anything and you didn't assume you knew what I needed. And when I needed to go alone, you let me go alone. And that, her voice caught, not breaking, catching the way a wheel catches on a stone and then keeps rolling. That is harder to repay than money because I can't write a check for it. I can't put a number on it. It doesn't fit in a ledger. No, I said, it doesn't. So how do we account for it? I looked at her, at the woman in the rocking chair in the gold light, with the desert stretching out behind her and the mountains going dark. At the woman who had lost everything and carried someone else's shame and set it down at the right doorstep and walked away. At the woman who had come back, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had somewhere else to go and chose not to. Maybe we don't, I said. Maybe some things just are without columns. She rocked, the chair creaked. The first star appeared above the ridge.